Video, I want to go over some grammatical ideas to remember as you write your papers. I'll talk slower in this video so you can really digest it a bit more. The last one was just a summary of what you've learned, so I went through it pretty quick. So, commas. Commas are used all the time, but they should be used for specific reasons. I tend to be horrible at commas. I do something called comma splices. That's putting them in places where they're not necessary. And so commas are my weak point, right? We all have a weak point, and commas are mine. So here, I do know the rules of them, just I have trouble using them. But here are the rules of commas and how they should be used correctly. You use a comma to join two independent clauses. We use all this fancy information English people do when they talk about clauses and stuff. Basically, is it a sentence? That's what that means. Is it a sentence? If you have two sentences that could stand on their own, you can put a comma between them and like an and, but, or, and you just joined two sentences. You just got them married, right? You married two sentences. So let me give you an example. Sally ran. Sally likes to run. Okay, those are two separate sentences. They have a subject and a predicate, and they make sense. I could say Sally ran, comma, and Sally likes to run. I joined them up. They got married with an and, a but, or an or, something like that. So here's another example below. The blue ribbon went to Susanna, and Sarah got the red ribbon. See, without a comma, what would happen here? Let's delete it. Without a comma, it would say the blue ribbon went to Susanna and Sarah. Got the red ribbon, right? You could read it wrong. You could read that both Susanna and Sarah got a blue ribbon and just a weird hanging out there got the red ribbon wouldn't make sense. So in order to read it correctly with the rules of the road, without any confusion, the comma would be there with an end. I was smart and I knew it, right? So I was smart and I knew it. Now, you don't need a comma here. Because when you have one person or subject or thing that does two things, you never need a comma. This is where my comma splice comes in. I'm the worst at this. So again, if you have one person doing two things, you don't need commas. So I like to ride bike and swim. I wouldn't need a comma between the ride bike, comma, and swim. That would be wrong. That would be a comma splice. So you don't need that if one person is doing two things. No need. You use a comma to set off, I love doing this, introductory words or a clause, or in a transitional expression. So let me give you an example. At the beginning of the sentence, you might have like one or two words and a comma, and then you do your sentence. That's because you're using those one or two words as a transition. For instance, comma, I just did an example. Or you could say similarly. So if two authors' works are very similar in idea to each other, and I want to cite one author, and then I say, Davis said that students do better in uncomfortable situations. And Tinto said discomfort leads to higher levels of memory retention and learning. If these two different authors are saying the same thing, I could start by saying similarly, right? Davis said that students do better in uncomfortable situations, period. Similarly, comma, Tinto says that uncomfortable situations lead to higher levels of memory retention. So the similarly there was key. That was a directional transition. So are words like however, therefore, all those words are kind of thus, nevertheless, in fact, transition words that help you understand how one thing is playing into the whole. Introductory words or a clause is something like, for the example I have here, when Emily Gregerson died, comma, our whole town went to the funeral. So it's kind of like you could take that part out and the sentence would still stand, but it's just like a little bit of an introduction. These are my favorite to do. I do them a lot when I write. You can use a comma to set off an item in a series. We all know this, right? We're all really good at listing things and using them. Most people have done this a bit in their life. So right here is the example. Egg salad, comma, peanut butter, comma, ham, I think I meant to write ham there. Ham, comma, cheese. So they're used to, a few years back, they got rid of the need for this comma after ham. That's called the Oxford comma. It's the last comma before the and, but then they made it that you have to do it again or else it doesn't make as much sense. And I agree with that. So you need a comma after the second to last thing in a list again, right? So some people I see do this wrong. Students do this wrong, especially those students who went through their high school a few years back because they learned not to do it. But nope, it is a mandatory thing again. So you use a comma to offset non-essential elements in parenthetical information. I love to do this too. This is when you do an aside, right? So if I were saying, like, Sally wore a red dress to the wedding, and I would say, Sally wore a red dress, comma, if you could call it a dress, comma, to the wedding, right? I just added a little more information. Scandal, that was an aside. And so that's something that's my favorite thing to do because I like to squeeze in as much info as possible in the shortest space as possible. So on my example here, this is a real example. My sister, comma, Tiffany, comma, also has red hair. Yeah, and like I use this example because if you see that I didn't have to say my sister's name, you don't have to know my sister's name is Tiffany in order to know that she also has red hair. So it's like extra information. It also changes the meaning here though too, because if I were to just put with no commas here, my sister Tiffany also has red hair, it seems to imply that I have a lot of sisters. So I'm like saying like my sister Tiffany out of like 25 sisters or something. But with the commas, it implies that I only have one sister. So it kind of changes the meaning a bit here too. You can use comma whenever you have a direct quotation. You would use a comma kind of like to set it up, right? So one student once said, "This assignment is pure crap." This is also true. I just wrote this as I was making this. So one student once said, "This assignment is pure crap." And I responded by laughing because I couldn't help myself and said, "That's really strong language because it is partly crap." So as you see there, I put parentheses for my aside information, but from what you just learned, I could, because it was aside information that's not necessary, I could put some commas in there, and that does the same thing as the parentheticals. You can also use a comma to offset a direct yes or no, interjections, or tag questions. So if you've ever taken Spanish, a lot of Spanish has tag questions, right? They will say something at the very end of a sentence that makes it a question, like the dog didn't bite you, right? And then before the right, you would put the comma. Before the tag question, that little question that appears at the end, you would put the comma. You also, if you answer someone, you say yes. So a lot of times you guys will email me questions and I'll be like, yes, comma, and then I'll explain why. Or no, comma, explain why. So that's when you use them. All right. Semicolons. These are also one of my my favorite things to use ever, mostly because I never see them and I feel like they deserve a spot in the world. So semicolons are used when you have two different sentences, just like I said before, two different independent sentences, and you want to get them married. You want to marry two sentences, but you also don't want to use an and, but, or anything, or not. You don't care about those things. You just want to get them married quick. This is a Vegas wedding. So in this situation, you would just put a semicolon between the two sentences. You made them one magic sentence, and the ideas are supposed to be conjoined. So when I'm reading literature, when authors use semicolons, I know that these two different ideas mean something together, very specific. So it's kind of a cue for me to pay attention. So here is an example of that. I just wrote this up. He asked her to get coffee for him during the meeting. Semicolon. She deeply hated him. Those are two different sentences, right? This actually happened to me once in a meeting. And two different ideas, but because they're conjoined together, that means one, they have to relate to each other. That means she hated him probably because he was asking her to get coffee during a meeting. So yeah, that would make sense why the semicolon was there. So you use semicolons when you also have a series of a list, like we saw like ham and cheese before. If you had a series like that, but some of the items in the series actually had commas in them, then you would use semicolons to separate the series. Let me give you an example of that. So let's say I wanted to say, I have a ton of things to pack, books, note paper, and pads for the office equipment, and pens, bowls, Tupperware for the